Good evening sa inyong lahat.
Good evening po, Doc. Salamat po sa pagdalaw.
Sana nakapag-dinner na tayo.
Sana nga po. Labor Day po ngayon eh.
Ha? Sino?
Labor Day, Doc.
May birthday? Tama ba? Ang dinig ko.
Hindi, Doc. Labor.
Ah! Kaya nga tayo nagle-labor eh.
Laboring with the text.
We celebrate Labor Day by exerting labor. By the way, nagdi-deliver na yung book depository ulit.
Oo, Doc. Pero ano nga eh, yung aking in-order sa Amazon, nung December pa lang hanggang ngayon, hindi pa dumadating yung iba.
Ay, wag na. Matagal na akong di nagpapadeliver sa Amazon.
Sinulatan ko, yung nakakatawa, Doc, sinulatan ko. Tapos, so, nagulat sila, hindi pa daw dumating. Sabi nila, magpapadala sila ulit. So, nag-send out sila na naman ng mga February yun.
Saan mo, ano address ang pinadala ang inano mo?
Yung, dito sa bahay, Doc, Marikina.
Kasi, dinideliver nila sa post office. Tapos iniiwan na nila doon.
Sa amin kasi, Doc, kapag pumunta po ako sa post office, hinahanapan nila ng slip. Kasi sa amin, kapag may parcel po doon, bibigyan pa po kami sa bahay ng slip. Kung walang slip, opo, hindi kami ine-entertain kapag walang slip.
Yari. Siya, lumipat ka na, wag ka na mag-Amazon.
Sabi ko, ilang libro yon? Para mga 7 libro yon?
Sayang.
Oo. Sana dumating ba?
Nakapagpa-deliver na ako last week.
Dumating naman, Doc? Hindi pa?
Ka-o-order ko. Pero tinanggap na nila. Ano na raw, na nag-ship na. Pero yung mga local, madaling i-deliver.
Paanong local po?
Local books. Local booksellers.
Ako, mga local na. Alam niyo, Doc, yung napag-usapan natin dati. Yung dun sa may Maginhawa.
Community
Oh, ma-red tag tayo dito.
Agawan po ba yung pumipila na?
Napaghalatan ba ako?
Nagpa-deliver galing sa community pantry.
May Grab na dumating, no? Ay, para po kay Anton. Hindi, yung romance, Doc. Ang dami ko nang nabili. Hindi ko pa napipick up. Siguro mga nasa 8 na yun.
Yun. Pero wala pang bayad yun?
Hindi, nabayaran ko na po.
So i-reserve naman nila basta may bayad ka na.
Sorry ako ng sorry nga lagi kasi parang hapon lang po sila bukas.
Bakit tayo mong pick up eh?
Mayaman ako, Doc. Ano lang?
Baka iba pinipick up mo.
Gusto ko lang bilhin. Ayoko i-pick up. Hindi. Ayoko kasing sadyain eh. Yung gusto kong isabay kapag lumabas ako. Kapag may na-pick up na iba.
Baka hindi na kumasya yun doon.
Motor lang yun.
Magkano na yung 8 pieces na yun?
Ay, parang ano lang. Nasa may 4,000, 5,000 lang. Pero magaganda. May mga mura po eh. Tapos may mga medyo mahal.
Tapos pagdating mo ron, madalagdagan pa, no?
Oo. Kaya ang tip, wag pumunta na may pera.
Oo. Then talagang magpipick up ka lang.
Oo. Oo, hindi katulad ng iba na may Gmail pang nilabas.
Kanina, speaking of pick up, pinick up ako kanina.
Para, papunta saan?
Sa QC.
Diba?
Pero isang libro lang. Kahit sa isang taong nakita ko nagbebenta ng hinahanap ng libro.
Anong libro yun, Dok?
Secret. Saka ko na lang ipapakita sa inyo.
Sige. Makakasama yan sa in-order ko din. Na hindi dumating.
Actually, sinusubasta na raw ng post office. Sabi na nagbenta sa akin sa post office ko po ito na kuha Dami puro na binibenta. Dinidiscourse lang nila. Wala raw pong kumukuha.
Visit?
Mura lang. 300 lang ang bigay sa akin. So, paano? Kaya ako napilitang kuhanin. Yung address namin, hindi raw nababasa ng Grab o ng Lalamove.
Yan, kasi mahirap pag mga mansion, no, Dok?
Sabi nung seller, kung gusto niyo po, yung pong kapitbahay ninyo, nababasa po namin, gusto niyo po bang ipa-deliver sa kapitbahay niyo tapos kuhanin niyo na lang? Sabi ko, hindi nga kami nag-uusap ng kapitbahay ko eh. Nakakaya naman masyado.
Mapipilitan pa kayo.
Kaya kinuha ko na lang kanina. Okay, marami na yata tayo.
Pwede na po siguro tayo. Okay, good evening po at maraming salamat sa pagdalaw. Maraming salamat po sa pagdalaw sa ating noche ngayong gabi. I'm Anton po, and for tonight, this is our noche for the month of April, pero we are just holding it now po because of yung previous events natin. Kasi April was really a hectic month for all of us. For tonight po, our thinker is Caroline Howe, and the title of the essay is Privileging Roots and Routes, Filipino Intellectuals and the Contest over Epistemic Power and Authority. So I'll just read that very short biography there in the poster. She's a professor at the Kyoto University in Japan. She got her PhD in English Language and Literature, Cornell in the States, and she has quite a number of publications because before she was affiliated with the Ateneo Ateneo de Manila. She was affiliated with the Ateneo, and even at that time, she was really engaged in literature, in cultural studies, and to some extent, we could consider it already as Filipino philosophy. Well, I would want to consider that, but I know there will be a lot of people who wouldn't agree with me on that, and maybe we could talk about that later. Okay, so I am going to share. I'll mag-share lang ako. I'll just share my screen. Thank you for that. Share ko yung reading. Here. Okay. So this essay was published 2014 in Philippine Studies, Historical and Ethnographic Viewpoints. This essay actually was presented before, and she mentions it at the end. For those of you who were able to reach the end, she says here that it was presented in a conference in honor of Reynaldo Ileto. So the title of the conference was Historiography. I'll just zoom in. Historiography and Nation since Passion and Revolution Conference in honor of Professor Reynaldo C. Ileto. So that explains why the tone of this essay really centers on Ileto's reading of Orientalism and of Edward Said's Orientalism and his own take on Orientalism that was eventually published. And also that explains why she really engages various thinkers, and that would be covered by our colleagues tonight. Okay, so to start, I guess we could here maybe I'll just start reading the first essay. Reynaldo Ileto's essay, Orientalism in the Study of Philippine Politics, a germinal and stringent critique of key political science texts on the Philippines, generated some debate in Philippine studies by highlighting the collusion between colonialism and knowledge production that underpinned, and Ileto argues continues to underpin, epistemic claims made by American scholarship on the Philippines. This debate was more than just about ideas. It was also deeply personal because Ileto's piece was perceived by some of the scholars he criticized as an attack on scholarship written by Americans. Uh, well, my take, at least just to introduce the piece and to start already some discussion, my take on how she presents, or she critiques rather, Ray Ileto's, Dr. Ileto's work, is that certain exclusionary idea. So it seems that Ileto, conjures that difference or tries to underscore that difference between Philippine versus foreign, us versus them. But what becomes problematic is how we go beyond that Filipino versus foreign, or Filipino versus American in this context, to Filipino and American, Filipino and Filipino abroad, Filipino and Philam. So that spectrum, to say the least, makes the discussion more complicated because we are left to ask, or at least how she introduces in the essay, we are left to ask who has that stronger epistemic claim to what it is to be a Filipino. She says here, a close reading of Ileto's Orientalism piece and the responses to it of Filipinists, both American and Filipino, leads us to the larger Anglophone intellectual milieu in which Ileto appropriated Said's concept of Orientalism, enabling us to address head-on the crucial but problematic role of the intellectual as insider and outsider, vis-a-vis his or her subject of study and audience. Far from being peripheral to Orientalism and its critique, the question of the personal, that is the intellectual's own role and position in society, or more accurately, across different society, is central to the exchange not only between Ileto and his interlocutors, but also to Said and his interlocutors. Um, Let me just stop with this next line. The Orientalism debate indexes long-standing but as yet unresolved issues about the intellectual's claim to epistemic authority. I think this piece is rather timely, to just put it bluntly, because we see ourselves, the Philippines, or at least us, engaged in the university or the I forgot the term she mentions. For us engaged in the academe, because we find ourselves at that crossroad, both in time, because we're not, I mean, we're post-colonial, we live in a post-colonial country, post-colonial age. But at the same time, the access to knowledge is not restricted really as how she presents here in this essay. So how knowledge was, no, I mean, because of the internet, because of the democratization of knowledge, uh, it's not a widespread emancipatory thing that because knowledge is democratized in the country, all of us become better. But those who find themselves just like you and I in these situations that we know how to use them, so to speak. So perhaps to start the conversation going to start the conversation, uh, the Orientalism debate indexes long-standing but as yet unresolved issues about the intellectual's claim to epistemic authority. It brings to mind my, most of you, I've already told this experience to, the idea of for example, like philosophy, and is it something really reserved to to the academe, or like to highbrow studies, or is it something really that comes from the grassroots level solely? Because as how Caroline Howe would put it, there seemingly is that tug from 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 Ray Ileto and from people who engage with him between one group and the other. One group and the other. So again, the Filipino, the foreign, the Filipino, the Philam, and so on. But is it just like that, or is it something more? Sige po, Doc.
Thank you for acknowledging me, Anton. The other thing that I wish to point out, no, at least in this early part of the essay by Professor Carol Howe, I'd like her approach, no, na parang on one hand, explicitly, she's problematizing Reynaldo Leto's position on Orientalism. Pero implicitly, she's also problematizing the role of nationalism in an intellectual discourse. No? In this case, historiography, Philippine historiography. And in our case, if we appropriate what she's trying to say, philosophic discourse. No? Ako, up to this point, I really look at nationalism as a problem. Problem in a sense of a discursive problem. No? Huwag na natin isama yung nationalism as a political problem. Pero kahit na if we confine it only to intellectual or philosophic discourse, I personally believe na yun nga, parang it brings about, in a sense, it's healthy kasi it brings about a lot of questions. At yun naman yung kailangan natin sa philosophic discourse, di ba? Pero in a sense, para ding hindi healthy kasi once you bring in the issue of nationalism, some people para bang no longer wish to entertain questions. No? Para sa kanila, nationalism is a done deal, a foregone conclusion. In fact, for them, nationalism is not the question. It is the answer. So, like I said, sa early part ng essay, natutuwa ako kasi without saying it, Caroline Howe is able to suggest, no, that a so-called elephant in the text, no? Hindi elephant in the room. Yun lang, Anton, maraming salamat.
Salamat po, Doc. Would someone want to add also to the discussion, or like react to what Doc Jovi just mentioned? Yeah, kasi nationalism, maybe while we're brewing our thoughts, nationalism also forges yung ganong division ba ng inside and outside, or parang like what I mentioned po in the conference, that yung I would immunize myself kasi I recognize my identity that I share with the other person. So what also Caroline Howe, what Dr. Howe does here is to show how that becomes something controversial also in the academe. Considering the fact also that we, again, as I mentioned earlier, we are a very peculiar race. And I'm just preempting the discussion also. Yung ganong idea na if you go abroad, you are getting a better life for yourself. You're going there for greener pastures. And there is that guilt involved, that guilt associated na, pag umalis ka dito, parang iniiwan mo kaming lahat that are left to experience these sufferings. So at the end, who is more national? That becomes a problematic question that we're left with. So who is more Filipino, considering nga that a lot of our fellow citizens, our fellow countrymen and women are not within the country. I mean, it's a very peculiar case. Yeah, so I guess that would be a very nice introduction for us at least we have already this working idea of what we would expect for the rest of the essay. So we could perhaps begin with this first part. And in our groupings, we have Blaze and Romel. So would I mean just what I mentioned? Maybe you'd want to point out some passages that you think are very substantial for our discussion tonight.
Thank you, bro. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes. Salamat.
Okay. Pwedeng pa-zoom pa ng konti.
Ay, sige.
Kasi
Anong,
I'm just using my mobile phone eh.
ay, sige. Itong page ba? Or,
Yes, yung sa first paragraph.
hmm.
Yeah. So I would like to begin by reading the first paragraph before I give my personal take, perhaps. So, konting zoom pa, bro. Sorry. Kasi I'm just using my phone. So, in Orientalism and the study of Ileto discerned in the rhetoric and substance of modern-day approaches and writings a throwback to colonial discourse, with its ideas of evolutionary development, racial difference and hierarchy, and superiority of the West vis-a-vis the East. For example, analyze Philippine politics principally in terms of an outmoded model of patron-client relations, rooted in a sense of recalcitrant Filipino culture that was largely personalistic in nature, governed by passions, depths of gratitude, and personal loyalties. In blaming Filipino culture for derailing the adaptation of American style democracy by Filipinos, help cement the idea of Filipinos as the negative others of the Americans. So I think Dr. Uh, Dr. Caroline is trying to point out here how our fellow Filipinos were influenced by the American concept of politics. And I think during that time, or maybe what she's trying to say is that uh, the American way of doing things, especially in terms of education, perhaps the landscape of education during that time, uh, is something that influenced the Filipino culture to the point that we can still experience its fruit up to this point, if I may say that it is a fruit, uh, whether it is a bad fruit or a good fruit. Uh, so to the to the to the next paragraph, please. If in case there is interruption, I think we can also welcome that before I jump to the second paragraph. Or should
Siguro,
I?
siguro you could just
I think
proceed.
wala naman yung text. So Ileto faulted Carlande for pinpointing local personalistic ties as the key analytical unit of the political system, and bemoaning the entanglement of local, private, personal concerns with conflicts in the national scene. Several authors of the edited volume, An Anarchy of Families, notably Alfred W. McCoy, Michael Cullimane, and John T. Siddell, were criticized for retailing a series of simplistic binaries such as family versus state, particularly particularistic versus nationalistic, violence versus law, uh, clientelism versus genuine democracy, where the former is the negative pole. In this particular paragraph, I took notice of uh, the way Dr. Caroline used the term personalistic. I don't know if she would like to use it as a term as in uh, the same as the personalist movement, or she would like to use that as referring to the person himself. So that's something vague for me at this point. But I think uh, the point that she wishes to tell us is there are binaries that we should learn from the two opposing poles. And those political binaries are something useful in constructing our own Filipino way of thinking on things. And perhaps she is affirming the positive contribution of the colonialism, but at the same time, she is criticizing the things that we should do away from. So in the third paragraph, Ileto took issue with the reduction of Filipino political behavior to a matter of factional loyalty and rivalry, a reduction that downplays the role of nationalist sentiments as well as alternative visions of community in which power flows from the bottom up, as well and in which indebtedness is not simply a one-way oppressive relationship, but rather a reciprocal one. Uh, in this particular point, I think Dr. Caroline would like to tell us that at this point in time, indebtedness became a mutual way of showing gratitude, but it also, in a sense, something that is negative. Why? For instance, if a tyrannical one, would give you something in return, you would take it as a debt. And whenever this particular tyrant would like you to do something, no matter how evil it is, you will do it out of your gratitude to that tyrant. So I think that's a point that Dr. Howe or Dr. Caroline would like to point out.
I think siguro just to add yung dun sa sinabi mo kanina, Blaze, yung about sa personalistic. I think it was the criticism actually it's mentioned here later on. Yung the assumption na yung parang politics in the Philippines is something very personalistic. I think it's rooted then, I mean, yung claim na yun sa sociological study na tayo kasi as a people, things are very personal to us. Comparing there are studies that would show rin na, for example, like in other people, in other countries, if you would criticize their work, it's fine for them. They would say, well, it's just my work. That's not me. Pero sa atin, in Filipino culture, if your work is criticized, it's as if it's already an attack sa sarili natin. And so parang nagiging personalistic din yung politics in the sense na kuya, tatay, ate, nanay, yung ganun. Rightly or wrongly, Caroline House says.
Yes, tama. Naalala ko nga, bro, na kung halimbawa nga nabangga ka sa road, no? Sasabihin mo, bakit mo ako binangga? So, you are referring to yourself, di ba? Kasi it's something personalistic nga. So the idea is something personalistic. Hindi natin sinasabi na bakit mo binangga? No. So sinasabi natin, bakit mo ako binangga? So parang it is something like that. Diba? It is something constructed in such a way of thinking na parang whenever there is something that was put forward in front of you na sinasabi sa'yo o pinapamungkahi sa'yo kung ano yung kamalian mo, you take it something personal. Tama, no? Ang ganda ng point na personalistic natin. Thank you, bro, for that particular point.
And I think sige, Marife.
Hi, sorry po, gusto ko lang po mag-add sa discussion if okay lang. I know there are assigned for every paragraph, pero if okay lang po. I remembered Father Mercado's concept of sakop when you were talking about kanina yung parang personalistic. I think can I offer a much better word for it? I guess stemming from Father Mercado's research, he described the Filipino as holistic, something holistic, na hindi tayo maaaring mahiwalay sa mga bagay na malapit sa danas natin. And he would see tulad ng sinabi niyo kanina, sorry, I watched a thesis defense earlier today by a friend from St. Paul. His thesis was on mercado, and he described the concept of sakop in Duterte's populism, ganyan. So I parang naalala ko lang din po sa discussion yun na everything is personal to the Filipino, I guess, because our concept of quote-unquote sakop is actually, for example, the family is a microcosm. Like, we have a tatay, we have a nanay, and then nadadala natin yun sa ibang bansa, minsan sa workplace, sa government, Tatay Digong, Kuya Bongo, and such. And I think there's some kind of a prevalent holistic approach to that, I guess. Dagdag ko lang po, I'll offer some sentiments in po later, pero yun lang po. Sorry for butting in. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Marife. Sige po, Doc.
Makisaw-saw din. Babalik lang ako doon sa sinasabi ni Blaze kanina, yung personalistic. Well, it's an observation. It was mentioned by Ileto and then rehearsed by Professor Howe. Pero it's a position that was offered by yung scholars being critiqued by Dr. Ileto. Yung kanilang reading that our political culture is really personalistic. Magandang pakinggan, sabi nga ni Blaze, no? Magandang pakinggan. Pero from the vantage point of politics, hindi siya magandang pakinggan. Dahil personalistic means it suggests our inability to transcend ourselves. And kalakip nito, yung ating propensity to reduce everything to something that is personal. Okay? Kaya kung titingnan mo, yung patronage politics, halimbawa, yung padrino system, yung pakikiusap sa mga traffic enforcer, yung pagpapalakad ng papel sa UST pag hindi ka pumasa sa star, yung pakikiusap sa professor kapag hindi ka nakapag-submit ng papel,
Sa obra.
babagsak ka na. Dinadaan sa pakiusap kasi culturally, hindi lang culturally, yung ano nga yung tawag doon, yung unconsciously, we believe na everything can be negotiated at the level of personal. Sa tingin ng foreign scholars, it's negative in a sense na sa politika, ang requirement ay the ability of the citizens to rise above the personal. Yung think of the other person, or ang grander vision ay think of the larger polity or polis. Sa tingin ng mga foreign scholars, we don't have that kasi we continue to be trapped in that personalist orientation. Okay? Well, sa mga katulad ng trabaho natin, we may look at it negatively, pero sa mga pananaw ng mga politiko, hindi negative yan, positive yan. Kasi nga, tingnan mo naman na bawal ang ivermectin pero magbibigay ka. Kasi nga, tulong to eh, di ba? Sa kampanya, lalo sa mga eleksyon, ano, parang kaya-kaya magbahay-bahay ng mga politiko, di ba? Pero hindi kaya magbahay-bahay pagka-contact tracing. Kasi parang walang benepisyo sa contact tracing, pero may benepisyo ron sa, kumbaga, the personalist culture is being taken advantage of kasi mayroong sure gain doon sa pagkapanahon ng eleksyon. Anyway, Tapos mukhang mabisa yung kasi sa dito sa papel na to, hindi ako masyadong kampi kay Leto. Kasi parang I look at his position as rather conservative. Pero in a sense, no, yung kanyang position sa Orientalism ay parang he gives us a reason to rethink really the impact or consequence of Orientalism, hindi lang sa historiography, hindi lang sa political theory, kundi pati rin sa the way we look at ourselves. Example, buti nagsalita si Marife kasi maganda yung binigay niyang halimbawa na sakop, interpersonal. Kung tutusin yung sakop is a colonial concept. Drilled into our senses by the colonizers. Tapos ngayon, we take pride in it. So, anong nangyari doon? Parang mukhang successful talaga yung Orientalism at saka yung colonial na, how do you call it, conditioning. We no longer question sakop. In fact, we own it. Ang kinuha pa nga ni Marife, si Father Mercado. Apparently, Father Mercado sees something positive in it without realizing na yun yung key, how do you call it, instrument used by the Spanish colonizers to subjugate us. From the individual to the family to the entire community. So, yun lang po.
Sige po. Thank you po, Doc Jovi. Sige po, Doc Pam.
Hello. Thank you, Anton. Just a follow-up on what Jovi already mentioned. I also have a question. I have a question for Marife. Kasi, like Jovi, I'm interested in her reference to Father Mercado's idea of sakop. My question is, and then it's also interesting that she interprets sakop as I don't know. I heard the term holistic. Maybe she's and she could clarify. Baka ang ibig niya sabihin holistic culture, no? Na ang kultura ng mga Pinoy holistic, no? So yung sakop in a way resembles the idea of Salazar, the idea of Salazar of yung pantayo, no? Yung pantayong pananaw. So sakop tayo, ito yung ating kultura, and it's holistic. It is as if we're living in a bubble. Now my question, Marife, is, so if that is the case, what is the difference between sakop or holistic culture and, let's say, an insular culture, for instance, the conservative American culture? Now I ask the question, and maybe Jovi could help us in a way explore the idea, or para bang elaborate on the idea, because when we talk about the conservatism of America, I'm reminded by the rise of new populism, and I think that precisely that kind of American conservatism becomes the perfect, the perfect in a way it provides an incubation, no, for not what we refer to as new populism. That's why Trump was a very successful you know, figure, um, but in the Philippines ganun din, no, in a way. So ang question, so maybe we could explore that, you know, the idea of sakop uh, as holistic culture, and how is it different from conservatism. Sige, I'm just throwing those questions para medyo maging mas malalim pa yung ating discussion. And maybe Marife could respond to it. Maybe Jovi can also help us understand the relationship between populism and conservatism.
Sige po. Thank you po, Doc. I think Marife po would want to respond.
Kinabahan ako kay Doc Pao. Nagulat ako. Parang ako nasa thesis defense. Sorry, Doc. I wish to clarify lang po dahil medyo magulo po ata ako kanina because my thoughts are all over the place. I was pertaining to the holistic approach, I guess, I think Mercado used the holistic approach to describe the Filipino as an individual. Although in his concept of sakop, he would say that a Filipino, though an individual, holistic in nature, is also person-oriented. So he kind of thinks of himself as belonging to and identifies himself with a group or a sakop. So there is a kind of a strong bond or a strong relationship formed, not only in the concept of a family or in the concept of siguro a block or faculty or a group of people with the same interests, but also on a macrocosm of things, sakop as in we can see it in the government or I don't know kung medyo malayo na po sa topic, we can see it in the DDS perspective of them calling Duterte as Tatay Digong, like what I said earlier, Kuya Bongo, and then Ate Amy Marcos, I think. May nakita po akong post na ganun. So, yun lang naman po. Although I don't really have any thoughts right now on conservatism, maybe Doc Jovi can fill that in for me. Pero I would also like to highlight also yung sinabi ni Doc Pao kanina regarding the theory of Jus Salazar when it comes to historiography, the pantayong pananaw. I think that's also a good discussion to enter into this reading group tonight because we can see here, Caroline, how tackling the concept, the pagtatalaban, the dichotomy between what is nasa loob and what is nasa labas. And although she viewed it from the first few pages as something of two extremes, I think we can also garner from this that although the scholar, or more specifically, the scholar of philosophy, siguro dahil sa context ni Kuya Anton kanina, as we can see, the scholar of philosophy from inside and the scholar of philosophy from outside has their certain biases. I mean, we can never really, mahirap na sumandig tayo sa mga pamantayan kung ano ang mas Pilipino o kung ano ang mas filosofiya. This actually brings to mind one of Napoleon Mabaqueo's article on distinguishing what is Filipino philosophy. There he says that merong mga pamantayan to know if a text is Filipino or more Filipino or most Filipino. I mean, what is that? When we lure ourselves into algorithmic obsessions or obsessions on standard, it's kind of problematic. And I like that part where Carolyn how tackles it in this text. So, ayun lang po, sorry. I think I've gotten ahead of myself. So, thank you po.
Okay, thank you, Marife. You don't have to apologize kasi that's precisely the reason why you're here to share your thoughts. And that's the whole point of organizing a reading group. But isn't it that precisely one of the and I think Jovi mentioned it earlier, one of the problems, or maybe the main problem is precisely with the term sakop. Because if you translate it, into English, basically, ano bang sakop sa English? Parang you're talking about a kind of covering, no? Yung uh, parang taklob, parang ganun, no? Sakop, no? Uh, kaya nga sinakop tayo ng mga Espanyol, di ba? Ng mga Amerikano. Pero at the same time, sakop can in a way also denote perhaps a kind of insular consciousness. Okay. And so I don't know if sakop is necessarily a Filipino trait, because it could very well be a trait of any race or any culture. Like, for example, American culture, the conservative Americans, which if you study recent history, very recent history, it seems like that sakop mentality of American conservatism is more pronounced, especially in the past few months. So yun siguro yung problema din dun sa yung the word sakop.
Sige po. Thank you po, Doc Pau. Si Doc Jovi po, and then si Sir Teng, tapos ako po.
Salamat, Marife, for your sharing, and also for to Doc Pau. Sa akin, just to tie it up with the text tonight, I already mentioned my position vis-a-vis Ray Ileto's reading of the so-called American scholars. Kasi, and they are one in saying this, no? Kung titingnan mo nga yung parang response ng mga American scholars na yung to Reynaldo Aleto, in contrast to his biting criticism of them, parang mas modest pa yung mga American scholars na yon. And kung titingnan mo rin yung very, very subtle portrayal of Caroline Howe, of their dialogue, she also seems to suggest na Filipinos may not always be the best providers of our self-description. And again, babalikan ko ulit si Father Mercado. Sumalangit na ba ang kanyang kaluluwa? I really find it surprising that a priest like Father Mercado would celebrate the notion of sakop. Kasi nga, like I said, this was the instrument of subjugation carried out by the Spanish colonizers. It's a Tagalog rendition of the Spanish term reduction. At sa reduction, yung sakop parang parang walang suggestion of violence there, no? Pero yung reduction kasi, dati silang naninirahan lahat sa tabing ilog, marami sa tabing dagat. They were all transposed from that locality and forced to live under the bells. And hindi lang forced to live their localities. They were restricted from ever leaving that place. So yung mga dating mangingisda, yung mga dating magsasaka, yung mga dating mangangaso, wala. Para itong lockdown ngayon. You can't go anywhere without the permission of the friar or whoever is the encomendero. At para sa akin, i-celebrate mo yon bilang picture of who we are. Pasintabi kay Father Mercado, pero hindi mo ba nabasa yung dialogue ni Elias sa Noli Me Tangere? Kasi si Elias, biktima ng sakop. Kaya siya nagtatago kasi ayaw niya na magpasako. And ako personally, I refuse to picture myself at kapwa ako Pilipino na yung sakop ang magiging portrait ko o natin. It is in this sense na parang you can appreciate yung sinasabi ni Benedict Anderson na a nation is an imagined community, especially sa katulad natin who had a very long colonial experience kasi wala tayong specific point of reference. We can't use religion. Some people refuse to use religion as their point of reference. Hanggang ngayon, some people refuse to consider language as the point of reference. Kung titingnan mo papakinggan mo yung sinasabi ni Dr. Ryan Mabolok ng isang gabi. Hanggang ngayon, mayroong resistance on his part. And apparently, he's speaking in behalf of his fellow Mindanaoans to identify themselves with Luzon. Para sa kanila, wala tayong shared history. So, this might be long, pero mga 3 minuto na lang siguro. Instead of sakop, people like Andres Bonifacio and Emilio Jacinto, na by the way ay tumasan, ginamit yung salitang bayan. And bayan has the suggestion of being inclusive, pero even that was a failure. Dahil yung bayan nila, kung titingnan mo yung diskurso ng mga Katipunero, yung bayan na yon, ang ginamit nilang reference ay Katagalugan. Eh siyempre, hindi yan magugustuhan ng maraming outside the Tagalog region. Although some historians would say na Katagalugan was used in reference to places or localities that were back then were already up in arms against the Spanish government and the Spanish friars. Pero sa tingin ko, even that was a failure dahil when that notion of bayan was tested in Cavite, nag-epic fail na, di ba? All of a sudden, hanggang ngayon pala, mga tribo pa rin tayo. Kung yung mga fan dito ni Fernando Poe Jr., probably you would recall yung pelikula ni Fernando Poe Jr. at saka Ramon Revilla na Sayo ang Tondo, Akin ang Cavite. That was in reference to Emilio Aguinaldo and Andres Bonifacio. Because Andres Bonifacio was from Tondo and Emilio Aguinaldo was from Cavite. So doon pa lang, nag-dissipate na yung notion of bayan. Kaya, again, to tie it up with the text, parang, if we will just rely on our local eyes to read our history, paan? I don't know. Kung anong history mapupulot natin. I mean, it took Alfred McCoy, one of those writers criticized heavily by Alejo, not Alejo, Ileto rather. It took Alfred McCoy to identify really yung one of the sources of our political malaise, yung ating pagiging family-centered. And the reason why until now we remain incapable of even imagining the possibility of a state. Because we are too absorbed by this notion of family. Doon pumapasok yung sinasabi ni Sir Pao kanina na conservative strand of politics. That when it gets exaggerated, it becomes populism. So yung ganong conservatism, when it's bloated, it becomes the kind of political crisis that we are facing right now. Tayo against sa kanila. Hindi sila kasama eh. So kalaban natin sila. Yung the old notion of you're not with us, then you're against us. And like I said, I'm not out and totally against Reynaldo Ileto dito lang sa debate na to. Hindi ko nga alam kung ano yung motive niya for doing this, considering na he himself was a product of American educational system. And for a long time, he has been away. Kaya hindi ko alam kung ano ba to. Was this his way of para mabawasan yung detractors niya na considering him as an American boy? Para maipakita niya na di ako American boy. I'm actually against American scholars. So, dun muna. Thank you for listening.
Thank you po. Si Sir Einstein.
Thank you, Todd. Good evening muna pala kay Doc Jovi and kay Doc Pao. Yung sa akin naman, it's very simple lang. Yung more of a parang parang gusto ko lang expand yung critique doon sa sakop. In as much as, in a way, it's quite novel. No? Siguro yung isang kahinaan noong sakop, tingin ko, no? Personally, yung ano kasi siya, hindi mo kasi makita kung it's also a cosmic idea. No? Parang kung babalikan din kasi natin yung mga Griego, di ba, mapapansin natin na yung aperon halimbawa ay isang konsepto rin na meron ding ideya ng dike, no, yung justice. So kumbaga parang meron siyang cosmic idea. Yung nga lang, ang problem lang kay Doc Ileto, ay kay Father Mercado, na I also agree with Doc Jovi, is that yung pagbasa niya kasi doon sa sakop, nagsimula doon sa pagdating na ng mga Espanyol, no? Kaya tingin ko yung mga nobela tulad ng mga nobela nila Samar, yung mga nobela nila Cordero ay pagbalik pa palayo pa, no? Palayo pa doon sa mismong ideya ng kalibutan, no? Kaya nga sa Visayas, Mindanao, yung mundo na ang talagang salin talaga ng world, no, sa atin ay kalibutan. Kasi yung kalibutan ay para bang mas malawak pa at mas masaklaw pa doon sa ideya natin ng mundo, no? At kaya doon sa alam ko yung sa Umpil, yung nakaraan yung kila Sir Jovi, alam ko may kalibutan part nga doon, no? At isa sa mga in-invite nila si Alan Derain. At yung banal na aklat ng mga kumag ay isang nobela patungkol doon sa simula ng Filipino bago pa dumating ang mga Kastila. Ang isa kasi sa tawag ng mga Kastila daw sa atin ay mga kumag, no? At ang kumag ay isang maliit na insekto, no? Kumbaga parang ganoon kaliit, no, yung tingin ng mga tao, mga Espanyol noon sa atin. Pero ang sa nobela ni Derain, parang pinapakita niyo doon na may ibang klase pa ng pananampalataya doon na hindi pa natin nakikita. At tingin ko yun yung kahinaan nung sakop ni Doc Mercado, ni Father Mercado, dahil hindi yata na-account itong mga ito. No? Kaya I agree with Sir Jovi, no, doon sa fact na yun. Ngayon, siguro ang second point ko lang is that dahil sa ganitong klase ng kalituhan, no, nagiging malabo pa rin ngayon yung ideya natin ng epistemolohiya dahil para bang ang nangyayari ay masyadong eclectic, no, yung ating even in our actions, no, makikita mo sa mga bahay ng Pinoy na may cross po pero may Buddhist, may kung ano-anong mga relihiyon na nagpapakita sa kalituhan natin, no, bilang mga tao. At siguro yun yung no, isa sa mga parang sinasala pa natin, no, bilang kaya nabasa ko din dito sa sinasabi na yung klase ng binary, in a way na nakikita din natin kung nasan yung situation natin, pero ang sabi din dito ni Caroline Howe is that nagbibigay din siya ng isang malign intent, no, na unnecessary. Parang gano'n. Thank you po.
Thank you po. Thank you for that, Kuya. Yung what I just wanted to add po dun sa discussion is how yung also parang also tying into the text the importance of a locality whenever we speak of, kasi I mean whenever we say of the language that we are using is I mean it's very spatial to an extent, the sakop and stuff like that. Already implicit in it is a reference to a particular space. I mean that's why I mean just trying to tie things together. I think that also informs discourses, the places in which they happen, or from the places from where these people are coming from, entering the discourse. That just shows yung difference, for example, in interpretation of a singular context, or how yung tying it to the idea of the Filipino, how some people would say, no, a Filipino is someone just born in the country, stayed in the country, studied in the country, pero that would be a view not really shared by other people. I mean, if you would say only a Filipino is only these people who stayed in the country, it would be a view that wouldn't be shared by, let's say, a person who is both Filipino and American, born in the States. Just to use the example of 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 Dr. Howe, or yung at the same time it becomes exclusionary. We in trying to talk about what the Filipino is, parang defining it. That's why to an extent I also agree po with, sorry, I'm taking too much time pala. I also agree with the idea na parang the idea of sakop presupposes yung that enormous historical baggage that at the same time we would exclude people in the discussion. I think that's why Caroline Howe mentions yung Filipinist as reference to that type of, yung in the words of Agamben, yung exclusion. I forgot the phrase, but trying to include them, we exclude people in the process. Yun lang po siguro ang idadagdag ko. I mean that also explains why yung populist reason becomes something so prevalent, because yun nga, in trying to define it, we ultimately exclude people from the conversation. Maybe Romel would want to add also to make the discussion more substantial. Continue. It's racing.
Hi. Well, yan ang problema with when it comes to discussing Philippine studies of who we are, of what is of Filipino. Parang ganyan din yung nabobrought up dati kay Doc Leo Garcia, what is Filipino philosophy, of si Father Mercado. Pero the question is how do we assess, yung nga yung pinaka how do we assess the narrative na binigay sa atin ng mga American scholars. Sabi naman ni Sir Jovi kanina, modest naman tong mga American scholars na to. And nabasa ko sa page 34, like at the page 34, keynote niya si Azurin. So stated that unlike Filipino researchers, foreign scholars do enjoy distinctive advantages, particularly in the Philippines, such as better funding support and proverbial hospitality of Filipinos. And when faced with grave threats, they can seek protection from their embassies or pack up and go. Unlike Eleto, however, Azurin adopted a more sanguine view of the relationship between foreign and Filipino scholars and a positive perspective perspective on the outsider's privilege vista that does not cancel that of the insider. Okay, Azurin suggested, moreover, that we regard these contraposing privilege vistas as dialogue in reflexivity in hope that a yin-yang dialectic may emerge out of the continuing contention. In his own personal, by bringing up Ileto's own motive, okay, inexact, the fear that the other scholars might be intruding into Filipino scholarship and self-consciousness, as well as location and position as scholar, inexact his eminence in the field of being assured by his worldwide citation quotient. Okay, Azurin invoked territoriality turf and used the language of contention and competition to characterize the relationship between foreign and Filipino scholars. All right. There. Still, we as readers of Ileto, of Sindel, of even Father Mercado, how do we assess their writings, and how do we make our own narrative out of them? Kasi yung iba sa kanila patay na, si Father Mercado, so how are we going to, like, let's say, correct their writings? Kasi tama rin naman yung sinasabi ng other American scholars, but of course we have to be critical also of their language in favor or against us. Like yung sinasabing American democracy, what do you mean by American democracy not being adopted to the Philippines? And in America, we do they have a particular democracy na among the states is being adopted? Even in America, they have different laws per state. And these past weeks, we had a discussion with I had a discussion with other scholars of Dietrich von Hildebrand. Pag may mga name-mention na like certain values, they would say na this is how we are in the Midwest. So even them, they do have a particular value, every region in the US. So if we are going to attribute it to, or we are going to use it sa Philippines, like American democracy, what particular or specific system in the American democracy ang iko-compatible mo sa Pilipinas? Yun lang muna. And scholarly endeavors like them, they are funded, tapos sila of course we know the American citizens, meron silang, like, they are privileged whenever they criticize a certain a dictator. For example, si Marcos, sabihin natin, yung mga nag-criticize kay Marcos na Americans, more safer sila because they can, hindi immunity, but their government will help them. Unlike Filipino scholars, like I remember si Emerita Quito, pinuntahan yata ng mga ni Marcos during martial law when she tried to criticize Marcos. Okay, so yun na muna.
Thank you for that, Romel. Si Gab and then si Doc Jovin, then siguro after we could proceed to the next part. Mr. Gabriel?
Ayun po, thank you. So as for my contribution, particularly in opening another problematic within the text. So since na-mention na rin yung about territoriality and dialectics, no, I would say na when it comes to this territoriality, lalong nai-reinforce yung idea ni Edward Said sa Orientalism, yung the West and yung the rest, as in the Eastern subjects. Pero the problem with that is pa rin, is if we can observe, there are some of them, as for example, Reynaldo Ileto, as highlighted, that he was a Filipino intellectual that was working abroad. So doesn't that open up then na meron siyang outsider's perspective? But there's also another problem in a sense na if he suffers the same kind of problem as Zus Salazar, as stated in the paper, ang kaisipang Enriquez at Salazar sa Psikolohiyang Pilipino, ang tuligsan ng psikolohiya at etnolohiya sa pag-aaral ng kultura sa psikolohiya. Pero to extend the argument, sabi nga ni Virgilio Enriquez na si Zus Salazar is yung position niya is reactionary ethnocentrism, in a sense na nakalimit yung concept niya of the Filipino in the bansa or the nation. So kumbaga pag nasa Philippines lang is naka-confine lang doon. Pero I would say na no proper dialectics could occur or Aufhebung or sublation in Hegelian sense kasi if i-ignore yung outside perspective, then magsistay lang with the insider perspective. Kasi yung mga dapat i-problematize or nakikitang problems from an outsider perspective regarding the Filipino identity is na-highlight ng outsider perspective. Pero yung insider is naka-clarify niya kung ano ba yung mga totoong problematics or iba pang discourses na nag-o-occur within yung country na yon. Pero ultimately, another thing then na problem dito is that when trying to dichotomize between the Western Filipino intellectual na and yung Filipino intellectual within their own country, we must keep in mind na when we're talking about the Filipinos, as stated nga dito na, they've already beaten the Chinese na marami sila sa America rin, the Filipino are a nomadic subject. So they can't be centralized into, ito yung Filipino because ito yung mga nasa Philippines na kailangan ding i-take into account yung mga lived experiences nung mga nasa ibang bansa rin that share this central or unifying concept or identity of the Filipino. Pero they all have their own lived experiences and of course, mga different discourses then that would arise from that. So yun lang po. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Gabriel. Si Doc Jovi po.
Siguro, what I'm going to share is partly alluded to also by Gabriel. Earlier, si Romel na nagsalita, ito ba yung dakilang Romel? Tama ba?
Opo.
Nagbabalik. No? Anyway, yung nabanggit ni Romel yung the notion na Filipino remains a problem. Ako personally, it remains a problem. And ako personally, I wish that it would remain as such. Na talaga siyang problema. Na hindi siya ma-define. Na hindi siya mako-confine or ma-objectify into a category. Kasi the more that the Filipino remains a problem, remains undefined, or remains unidentifiable, mas magsisikap tayong mas maintindihan ito. Mas merong space for people to not only rethink the concept, but also rethink themselves in relation to that concept. Once again, it brings us back to the notion of imagined community. Kaya sa imagined community, precisely because of that, yung pagiging open space niya. Okay? So sa akin, hindi siya deterrent that it is a problem. It should in fact be one of our stimuli, one of our siguro incentives, no, for sustaining this attempt to understand ourselves and understand others the way they look at us. Which brings me to something na binanggit din ni Romel, yung values. Medyo allergy ako doon sa salita na yun. Filipino values, blah, blah, blah. No? Again, ito ay bahagi rin ng ating colonial history, was passed on to us, drilled into our senses, and now we take them as ours. Or worse than that, we take them as we. Kung tutusin, lahat naman ng alam na mga bata ngayon na Filipino values, much of it were bahagi ng ating American-inspired educational system. At yung mga, di ba, alam naman natin ito baliktad yung strategy ng Amerika at saka ng mga Kastila, no? To make us more malleable, pinadali ng mga Amerikano yung trabaho. They just define us according to how they want us to be. And we bought it. So, even katulad na yon, yung katulad ng konsepto ng value, katulad ng konsepto ng Filipino, sana they would remain problematic. No? Di ba, lagi na sinasabi na utang na loob, ano pa sinasabi? Hospitable, resilient. Ito, lahat ng ito ang gumawa ng problema sa bansa natin. Yung utang na loob, no? Kaya ayaw magsalita laban sa China kasi may utang na loob. Kaya okay lang na walang kwenta ang gobyerno kasi resilient naman tayo. So, ano yung hospitable? Again, pag bumagsak, pakiusap ka na lang, compassionate yan. Compassionate as in hospitable, yung ability to take in someone else. So, like I said, how I wish that these things would remain problematic. At least, doon man lang sa diskurso natin. No? Kasi yun naman yung trabaho natin. Yun naman yung contribution natin sa bayan, sa lipunan. Yung bang we are able to understand things better and hopefully we will enable other people to understand the same things in a better way. One last thing. The reason why I said sana maging problematic yung both Filipino and values dahil kung we believe that these concepts of Filipino and value are a done deal, then we become victims of our own obsession of identity. Again, in contrast to Ileto, sa tingin ko we have too much of that in not just in the way we look at history, but also the way we do philosophic discourse. No? We are consumers of identity. Ang kulang talaga natin yung alterity. Yung bang the ability to look at something from the perspective of someone that is different from us. Hindi nga magawa ni Ileto yon. Hindi magawa ng mga taga Luzon na tingnan yung bagay sa perspective ng mga taga Mindanao. Hindi nga nagawa ni Aguinaldo na tingnan yung problema sa perspective ni Bonifacio. Hindi natin magawang tingnan yung mga problema sa perspective halimbawa ng mga migrant na ito hindi lang rootless. Practically, they are stateless dahil sa uri ng gobyerno natin ngayon. So yung konsepto ng alterity sa tingin ko is an important missing ingredient. Like I said, not only in the way we view history, but also in the way we do philosophy. So doon muna, maraming salamat.
Thank you. Actually, this is quite interesting now. Sige po, Doc Pao, and then I'll say something after.
Okay, thank you. Just quick follow up to what Jovi said. I like what he said about the continuous problem, or that he wants the idea of the Filipino to be to be uh, perennially problematic. You know, and that reminds me of what Adorno said about identity and the non-identical in his negative dialectics. Um, uh, if we recast it in the sense of Adorno, then the non-identical, I think what Jovi is referring to is the non-identical identity of the Filipino. Because if the identity of the Filipino is non-identical, which well, that means that that kind of identity withstands cultural reification. Um, so it is an identity that is non-identical. Uh, uh, and I think that's in a way related to much of our problems regarding race, uh, racism in particular, gender, and other forms of uh, of oppression. Um, our inability to, well, Jovi used the word alterity, right? But our inability, but I think that what that means is that the, we lack the ability to um well, basically, you know, parang become the other, you know. uh, or yung parang yung, if you use that delusion idea of becoming other, you know, to look at things from the perspective of the other, even from the perspective of the virus or the perspective of the amoeba, right? That faculty we have not developed yet, I think, as a nation, or as a culture. Yun lang muna, and then gusto ko rin balikan sa yung sakop, pero mamaya ulit kasi may sasabihin pa si Anton.
Thank you po, Doc. Yeah, I was going to say something. Actually, nakalimutan ko sabihin kanina. I think also kasi we have grown, I don't know if it's a post-colonial experience, yung ganong longing sa something that is foreign. Kasi and I remember we have our in-house Habermasian scholar mentioned in our previous discussion.
We have an in-house Habermasian scholar. Yes, I didn't know that.
Sino yan?
Ano ba yan? Di nyo nakaka-insult naman, di nyo kilala. Our in-house Habermasian scholar. He mentioned to us,
well, in-house as in domesticated, gano'n.
Nasakop yun. Saklaw.
Nasakop ng bureaucratization na yung iron cage. Anyway, sabi niya na, well, he just mentioned Said in passing, but he said, I'm just gonna say what he said, kasi sabi niya what he does, Said, in his book is to really differentiate East from West, to say East is East and West is West, and they could just never meet. I mean, a reading like that would, it makes us understand, at least from a Filipino point of view, our certain homelessness to, or yung kawalan ng identity ng gunita. Kasi so, are we East or West? Unlike, kasi if we would just polarize the world that way, we would see na we neither belong, strictly speaking, to East or West, if we would consider West as the old world and East as the new world, or West as in global West and East as Asia, kasi with our history and all of those things. So parang there has we have gone into this parang fetishization of that which is exotic. So it's us versus them. In the desire, on the one hand, I would say for us to be like them, yung ganong, as what Gabriel mentioned, that type of sublation, that would entail a certain domination. Kaya kapag ikaw nakaalis ng bansa, hindi ka makabayan. Taksil ka. Pero mas but at the same time we brand them as and this is what Caroline Howe would later mention, we brand them at the same time as yung bagong bayani. That inability to posit a consistent narrative of what that experience is, I think that is rooted in that that fetish for the exotic that is peculiar, I would say, to the West. I mean, that's what drove them to the Spice Islands, not to the Philippines in the first place. Yun lang siguro. I think Gabriel raised his hand. Maybe he would want to respond to someone.
Thank you very much. And I'd also like to expound on Dr. Carino and Dr. Bolianos, especially with the mention of cultural reification. No, I also saw that kind of theme with particularly in Reynaldo Ileto, because if I'm not mistaken, there is this overgeneralization as mentioned in the article. I forgot which page. Pero yung the idea yung mga immigrants na kumbaga yung betrayal towards one's country, pero also yung na-mention yung careerism, na parang when we mention yung mga yung mga Western intellectuals, ganun kagad yung presumption sa kanila. Pero in a sense, even Reynaldo Ileto himself can be charged with yung othering, or in Spivak's term, no? Pero to clarify yung term na othering that I am utilizing, no, according kay Shebel de Apollonia, na it's a taxidermy of identity. Pero as we say the word taxidermy, 'di ba? It's not the real being. Hindi siya yung, it's just a representation pa rin. It doesn't capture yung essence nung real. So it's still reifying something, giving an identity na hindi naman talaga yun yung talagang identity niya, is just given. So same goes with na yung charge ni Edward Said sa West na they're giving an identity to the Oriental East. Pero at the same time, nako-commit din yun ni Reynaldo Ileto by overgeneralizing na ganito yung pagdating sa mga Western or even Filipino intellectuals from a Western perspective. Pero to expand yung argument kanina na walang sublation kasi ang nangyari sa kanila is na ma-marginalize even yung mga Western intellectuals na may alternative perspective. Instead of attempting na kumbaga yung Western intellectuals hindi nila alam yung conditions ng mga Filipinos, na dapat territorialization na dito lang, or territoriality na within dito lang dapat mag-bound yung discourse. Pero in reality, yung othering na to is nag-expand din sa mga Filipino intellectuals na gine-gatekeep yung understand or pag-comprehend ng condition na to that could have provided a more comprehensive discussion. So, ang nangyayari is, I would say that because of this othering that is committed by both sides, nagkakaroon ng aporia. Hindi siya pwedeng mag-move from yung discussion nila, since talagang, again, as stated earlier, walang meeting ground, walang middle ground between both of them, na they're just reproducing epistemic violence and an attempt at epistemic authority over each other. So that's all right now.
Okay, thank you for that, Gabriel. Sige po, Doc Jovi.
Maraming salamat, Gabriel, and also to Sir Pao earlier. Gusto ko lang siguro yung i-emphasize din yung accent given by the article on Said's notion of rootlessness. No? Kasi mukhang yun nga, in his notion of Orientalism, parang yun nga, yung rootlessness is being privileged, no, as something that will give us a better vista of the country or of the nation or the history. Pero siguro yung sinabi ko kanina na I would rather and I would prefer thinking of the Filipino as a perennial problem. Hindi in the sense of rootlessness ni Said. Gusto kong clarify lang yun. Kundi in the sense of homelessness ni Camus. In one of our conversations, nabanggit ko na ito yata sa iyo, Antonio, I would rather think of nationalism the way Camus understood homelessness. Kasi yung homelessness ni Camus, yung nandoon yung recognition of being dispossessed of your home, of your habitat. And yet at the same time, itong dispossession na to cultivates a desire to go further, to go beyond itong restrictions imposed by dispossession. I would rather think of call it Filipino or call it Filipinoness or Filipinicity, kung ano man yun. Pero whatever it is, kung yung ganoong how do I call it, kung yung obsession sa pagiging Filipino does not translate into homelessness, ay wala. Ano lang yun? That's sa tingin ko, that's a sure ticket to fascism. Yung bang tipong sabi nga natin na package deal notion ng Pilipino na unless you conform with this category or categories of being Filipino, then hindi ka Pilipino. That's not homelessness. Ewan ko kung this will be instructive. Kanina pa ako may mga allusion sa popular media. Yung mga nakakatanda pa sa asin, ayun, nandun tayo ng Sir Pao.
Anong?
Pasensya na kayo. Yung asin na...
Yung banda.
Oo. Although nagpunta sila sa America, hindi nila pre-promote yung sarili nila as asin. They call themselves NaCl. Just a joke.
Alcohol.
NaCl, sodium chloride. Anyway.
Ito pala mag-joke mga filo, no?
Sa na, ano? Siyempre, hindi ko alam yung title. Na hinaham ko siya sa isip ko ngayon pero yung
wala ka bang napapansin kapaligiran?
Hindi po, yung ang chorus niya, bayan ko, nasan ka? Ako ngayon nag-iisa. Yun yung anyway, baka may time kayo mag-YouTube mamaya, hanapin niyo yung kanta ng asin na yun. Pero sa tingin ko, that song captures yung homelessness na sinasabi ni Albert Camus. Tapos maganda ring balikan yung asin kasi sumikat yung kanta ng asin na yun doon sa first wave ng mga migrant workers papunta ng Saudi Arabia. Mga late 70s to hanggang early 80s. Pero pwede mong gamitin sa kanila, pero pwede mo rin gamitin bilang paraan ng asin upang, alam mo yun, isigaw sa bayan what was going on during the martial law years. Kasi parang ang sinasabi ng asin na you can likewise be prisoners in your own country. You can likewise be captives by your own government. At yung captivity na yun, it gives you it makes you feel the government as ever present. But it also takes away from you the notion of that bayan, of that being home. No? alam mo lang, lockdown ka, pero you don't feel at home at all. Yun po, maraming salamat.
Salamat po, Doc. Yeah, yung that's why minove ko yung slide to this the page, this the next part actually to yung exile is for Said a deeply painful spatial problem. Pero I mean the fact na ang daming OFWs in exile from yung idea of homelessness. Pero it becomes a common experience yung everywhere we go, may Filipino community. Marinig mo, just the other day, yung weird things that YouTube recommends us to watch, diba? I had this yung recommendation. I don't know why I watched it. Parang 1 hour siya ng ano lang, Streets of Japan. Tapos yung nakakatawa kasi, so ano siya, Japanese yung video. Rinig na rinig mo, may dalawang Filipino nag-uusap sa likod. Tapos nagchichismisan. Yung I couldn't you're trying to focus na sa pinapakita nung ano, but you could really hear na nag-uusap yung dalawang Filipino na I'm sorry to sound condescending, pero parang alam mo OFW in the way that Professor Howe would mention here na they come from the lower middle class to above lower class, lower than that. Tapos they're working in that situation without assurance of citizenship, unlike yung vis-a-vis what she does here sa mga academics.
Baka naman nag-academic visit yung mga Pilipino na yun.
Ano, pang picture lang sa...
Ibe-benchmark sila yung mga yun. Benchmarking.
Mali pala yung yung analysis ko dun sa... but that experience na as Dr. Howe would say, which is something very different from, for example, our case na we could go abroad and then we would be really able members of that community be as part of the academe. It's something that we pride, I would say, we pride ourselves in na yung job natin, our profession is not really a blue collar job. Na once we parang we leave the country to study, well, she says here, I think it's still, yeah, here, yung migrant intellectuals can play a role in changing the system, and describing it in language unavailable to those it has already subdued. In the very space of empire, so to speak, we are afforded, at least us in the academe, so already within the system, within the country, we see things from a different perspective. But what more, the fact that we go out. That's why if we would look yung periodization of Filipino philosophy, of some, for example, like how Dr. Ko would talk about it, it begins with Dr. Quito leaving the country. And then he puts himself at the tail end. I mean, first generation. That periodization is something that we see really in the academe, but also I would say in other disciplines, diba? Or in terms of economics, yung very practical matters. Yun siguro, I would just want to highlight that. Would someone want to? And so, well, we could just jump a bit to this next part, just briefly. So what would you mean by a middle element? I'm looking for I think we could just focus on. Okay, here, page 42. Okay, so more recently, a young physicist named Reina Bel Reyes has talked about highly educated Filipinos working in universities and research laboratories abroad, whom she labeled third culture PhDs based on third culture kids raised in a culture outside their parents. They possess multilingual abilities, doctorates, more rigorous work ethics, and a heightened cultural intelligence and sensitivity. They acquire not only valuable and highly valued skills, but also the gift of perspective, of the unnatural instinct to not take anything for granted, of the capacity to see the ordinary with fresh eyes, most importantly, the 19th century ilustrados 21st century TCP, third culture PhDs, learn firsthand that things don't have to be the way it has always been. Uh, Reyes, I'll just continue with this. Reyes vows to come home, and she looks forward to going back, not to return to the home I left, but to start on the one I'm going to help build. This promise of return is the most powerful antidote to conception among some Filipinos based in the Philippines of the, vis-a-vis the departure as betrayal. So like in the yung Philippine academic landscape, yung itong third world PhDs, we I would just say we kasi as in the academe, parang serve as this middle ground as how Dr. Howe would discuss it. That's why Ray Leto is very safe in his approach because yes, I'm an insider, a Filipino, but also an outsider as a person in the States. Pero yung ganong parang middle, it's also it's an ambiguous place, but it's something I would say that's like what I mentioned earlier pala kanina. It's something very Filipino, I would say. Neither purely east nor west, neither purely parang above or below. Or I mean, ito just to share. I mean, my experience growing up. In the Philippines, everybody thinks you're American. Basta puti, everybody thinks you're American. And then if you go to Germany, they know you're not German. They would say, "Oh, you're Turkish. Are you Turkish? Are you from Turkish descent?" Or that's immediately what they would think. So neither home in, uh, you're as how Dr. Howe would say, you're either home in both worlds or you're home in neither of the two. There's always that sense of unhomeliness. Um, I'm reminded of the article I read this morning, yung uncanliness, unhomeliness. Yeah. Okay, would someone want to add to that or? We have around some 15 to 20 minutes left, so maybe we could just jump to. Sige, Belgium.
Okay. Good evening po. I'd just like to share something concerning the idea that the idea of a third world ano yun, scholar or culture, something like people or scholars or intellectuals who are who have studied or who have the opportunity to learn from other regions. This is very this is a very, I think it has already created a stigma in our Filipino quote unquote consciousness when somebody who have studied abroad or perhaps in different regions would be labeled as someone who have who has a kind of superior prowess in terms of perhaps an academe or in his own field, in his chosen field, or in this context in the academe. I think also the one factor that created this kind of consciousness is that it's also the system, like the university, for example, or the like. I'm going to speak from my own observation, from my own context in here, no, from where I came from. Whenever someone who is sent from a certain university abroad or wherever is that, um, the, the university would always expect you to contribute something, and would always somehow compare your status in terms of learning whatsoever to those scholars or intellectuals who have been honed by local universities. So this factor, as I was saying, is that um, it is actually caused by the system, our institutional system also, because we created, I mean, the institution also created that kind of bias or somehow comparison. And so I would like to point out that supposedly, as a university or as an institution, like sending scholars abroad or whatsoever, they should also treat intellectuals or scholars or professors whatsoever who came from different regions or who came from different universities, to treat them equally. Kasi we, again, there's still a manifestation of, our Western mentality. Like, for example, um, if if a certain scholar is sent to Germany, for example, to study philosophy, he is expected to contribute better than those who are sent in, University of San Carlos, in UST, in Ateneo, or somewhere anywhere in the Philippines. And even in the local area, like for example, one is sent in the Visayas and one is sent in Luzon. The expectation is that if you came from Luzon, especially the big universities, including UST, there's always that expectation that you are going to contribute more when you return. So because there's an expectation that you learned more than those from those people who learned from the universities in the just nearby universities. So again, the point there, I'm just trying to repeat the point that the system or the university itself is always contributing to this kind of mentality as well. It's a structural factor that needs to be looked into. Yeah, I think yun lang siguro muna. Thank you.
Thank you, Beljun. Sige, si Kuya, si Sir Einstein.
Ano lang to, no? Dun lang dun sa middle class. Kasi parang may nabanggit din dito. I think si Sir Joey, nakausap ko din dito, no, yung mga nabanggit din niya yung how some scholars natin na hindi kasi lahat bumabalik no? So parang may tendency na magstay nga sila doon sa labas ng bansa. Pero siguro isa sa example na naalala ko dito si Bienvenido Lumbera kasi nag-aral siya sa Indiana University. Tapos nung nag-iisip siya ng topic about what he would write, no, naisip niya na magsulat sa Tagalog poetry, no, from 18th century to I think may certain period lang Then yung libro na yon that was published abroad tsaka dito, eventually led to parang a re-understanding nung tula natin, no, parang it push forward yung modernity din, no, ng tula natin na sinundan ng mga akda nila Virgilio Almario, yung mga akda nila eventually, although medyo mas nativist yung approach ni Virgilio Almario, pero yung idea ni Lombera ay ipakilala, no, yung tula ng mga Pilipino, hindi lang para sa mga Pilipino kundi para sa mas malawak na mambabasa. So tingin ko yun din yung kulang tingin ko sa Pilipinas, yung magsulatan tayo sa isa't isa. Parang hindi yata natin din kasi masyadong kilala yung isa't isa rin, no? Halimbawa, pagka nagko-quote tayo ng mga authors like novelist, no, halimbawa, may tendency paratin na i-quote halimbawa yung mga foreign. Pero marami naman ding mga bata ngayon na nobelista sa Pilipinas na they're very aggressive, no, and halimbawa yung isa nga ay nagtuturo ng Philippine Studies sa Japanese sa Osaka University, no, si Edgar Samar, at lagi niyang kinukwento sa akin kung paano yung mga Hapon ay tuwang-tuwa, no, sa mga akda na sinasalin niya, no, kasi natuto na rin siyang maghapon, no, so may ilang siyang naisalin sa Hapon. So tingin ko isang level din ito, hindi ko alam kung masyadong related pa dito, pero I think isang level din ito ng hindi lang pagtingin sa loob, no, kundi pagtingin din dun sa kakayahan natin na hindi lang manatili sa loob, kundi lumabas sa loob, palabas talaga. Palabas, yung parang i-introduce talaga. Although matagal pa yon, but I think it's starting to gain steam, at least sa literature and other disciplines. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir, I think Gabriel raised his hand. So after Gab, we could have Marife.
No po, since conclusion pa po pala yung thought or idea. Amen pa po pala.
Thank you. Sige, Marife. And then I'll say something after.
Hi po. Adding lang po to certain analysis kanina. I would like to add something regarding the intellectual history of Filipino philosophy. I guess I think it is safe to mention here Dr. Emmanuel De Leon and his conclusion sa kanyang naging disertasyon at naging libro na rin na mga tumasina sa pilosopiyang Filipino, na meron siyang minumungkahing pamamaraan ng filosofiya na nagmumula sa loob tungo sa labas. Naniniwala siya na, if I remember correctly, na sapat na ang mga binhi na kailangan itong itanim, na hindi kulelat kung ano man ang usapin ng namamagitan sa pagitan ng ating mga intelektual. At may pangangailangan na para yumabong yung diskurso na yun, kailangan nating mag-usap, pag-usapan sila at pag-usapin sila. Dahil kung makikita, meron din silang mga minumungkahing mga teorya o pamamaraan ng pag-iisip, ng pagtanaw, na likas din mula sa kanilang sariling pamimilosopiya. I know we believe most of the time that wala nang original sa ganitong ideya, wala nang original sa ganitong teorya, nasabi na lahat ng kanluran, o nasabi na lahat ng mga Griego, ng mga Indiano, ng mga Chino. Ngunit kung titignan ng pamimilosopiya ng mga sariling atin, ng mga nakikipag-ugnay at nakikipag-isa sa talastasang bayan ng mga Filipino, makikita natin na marami pang maaaring pag-usapan. At kinakailangan na magsimula sa atin yun. Kaya nga parang minumungkahin ni Doc Eman na isang pamimilosopiyang mula sa loob tungo sa labas, na hindi lang tayo nababara sa usapin ng kung ano ang sa atin, pero usapin din yan ng kung anong may aambag ng nagsimulang usapin sa atin tungo sa isang mas universal na espasyo. Dahil universal nga naman ang filosofiya. Kaya parang naisip ko rin po dito na sa larang naman ng filosofiya, alam ko nagsisimula pa lang diskurso. Nakita na ng mga philosopher natin tulad nila Dr. Ko na there is Filipino philosophy at its birthing, that there is a lot of potential in this, and that we cannot stop at this potential and we need to move. We need to, tulad ni, I think si Doc Pao yung nagsabi nun, kailangan nating magkaroon ng kultura ng sulat, basa, debate para yumabong itong mga pinag-uusapan natin ngayon. Dahil kung tayo-tayo lang, magkakaintindihan tayo totoo. Pero hindi tayo dapat manatili lamang doon dahil meron pa tayong labas na patutunguhan. Pero bago nating patunguhan yung labas, kailangan mo nating suriin at alamin kung ano pa yung maiaambag natin dito sa loob. So, yun lang po. Thank you po.
No. Thank you for that, Marife. Siguro just to Doc, so, ilan pa? Sige, kayo na po, Doc. Tapos after si Gab. Then after Doc, si Gab na.
Huling hirit na to kasi mag-alas 10 na eh. Bibilisan ko lang. Yung in response lang to Berjun, no? Maraming salamat dun sa comment ni Berjun. Ako, ang take ko lang doon sa sinasabi ni Berjun, siguro hindi naman kasalanan ng mga nakapag-aral sa abroad na pinalad sila na makapag-aral sa abroad. Kumbaga, hindi naman kasalanan na makapag-aral sa abroad. Ang siguro maituturing natin kasalanan, kung kasalanan namang masasabi, eh yung kasalanan na nag-aral ka sa abroad pero nakalimot ka. Ibang usapan yun. Pero yung mga nag-aral sa abroad, pero sa kabila ng pagiging nasa ibang bayan, eh patuloy na nakakaalala. Kailangan natin ng mga ganon. Tandaan natin na yung pinag-uusapan nating nasyonalismo, bayan, Pilipino, hindi yun nausbong kung wala mga taong umalis muna at pumunta sa ibang bayan para pousbongin to. Ang tinutukoy ko rito yung mga nasa propaganda. Kumbaga parang, yun yung sinasabi ko kaninang problema sa identity thinking na dahil kaiba sa atin, kadalasan, iniisip natin na wala na itong maitutulong sa atin. Samantalang kung babasahin natin halimbawa yung kasaysayan na madalas natin nakakalimutan, sino ang sumulat ng hanggang ngayon ay tinuturing na authoritative na history of the Visayan Islands? Si Alcina, Castilla. Sino ang pinagkakautangan ng maraming Filipino historians na pag-aralan yung pre-Hispanic Philippines? Si William Henry Scott na Amerikano. Sino ba nakakuha ng Laguna Copper Plate na hanggang ngayon pinagdiriwang ng lahat yata ng Filipino historians and anthropologists? Si Anton Posma, hindi si Anton Resland. So, sa akin lang, again, yung going back dun sa alterity and to tie it up with the notion of the middle na dinevelop ni Dr. Howe towards the end of the essay. And again, i-tie up ko kay Camus. Ganun din kasi yung iniisip ni Camus. Yung homeless na sinasabi niya, hindi matatagpuan, yung home na sinasabi niya, yung homeland, hindi matatagpuan sa isang espesipikong lugar o espesipikong panahon. Matatagpuan ito habang papunta tayo doon. So yun lang siguro. Maraming salamat.
Salamat po, Doc Novi. Maybe, Gabriel, you could mention something about yung last part before I say something.
Yes po. Ayun. So I'll with as a serve na rin as a conclusion, no? Particularly yung sa subheading na toward regional and global dialogue and collaboration to tie all the concepts in. I would say na yung dichotomy between yung inside versus outside, metropole versus periphery, west versus the rest, or departure versus dichotomy. I would say na I would like to call on yung concept ni Baudrillard na it's simulation, na yung kind of binary opposition between yung inside versus outside is something that reproduces yung monopoly ng epistemic authority dun sa pagdiskurso pagdating sa ano nga ba talaga yung Filipino identity. Kasi if anything, na kikip niya yung same policy ng divide and conquer, ng policy ng Amerika dati in the educational system, nare-reproduce siya sa intelligentsia or sa academia natin ngayon because of this particular problem or problematic ng identity ng Filipino, na who holds this monopoly over the Filipino identity? Yung Filipino intellectuals ba? O yung Western intellectuals na nanirahan doon or na-immerse doon sa Filipino way of life? And as stated nga dito kay Ileto, na the process of simultaneously being formed by and contesting the political, social, and cultural hegemony of Spain in the United States, and to a lesser extent Japan, has made most Filipino intellectuals keenly aware of the dilemmas in positing pure forms of the Western or the indigenous or the local versus the global. Pero he also notes here na, scattered yung mga Filipinos, there is no fixed them. So, masabi natin na yung attempt at monopolizing ng inside and versus perspective contradicts yung statement ni Ileto na walang fixed na Filipino, because ultimately, talagang yung iba't ibang lived experiences, either yung mga nasa abroad, it should be taken to account to constitute what really is a Filipino identity. And mag-move on siya from this attempt at epistemic superiority, yung simulation ng discourse, to an actual discourse sa ano nga ba yung kondisyon ng mga Pilipino. And once na nagkaroon ng sublation between this outside and inside perspective, only then na magkakaroon ng possibility at praxis, no? So aside from posturing, magkakaroon ng konkretong action sa, okay, so ito yung condition and here is the solution. And as stated nga kay Said na, just because you represent the sufferings that your people live through, which you yourself might have lived through also, you are not relieved of the duty of revealing that your own people now may be visiting related crimes on their victims. So that's all.
Thank you for that, Gabriel. Siguro just tying all of our loose ends together. This article is on yung epistemic title, sorry. Filipino intellectuals and the contest over epistemic power and authority. And we've really heard a lot about yung situations of the university, of knowledge and stuff like that. I just, in connection to what Gab just mentioned, I want to highlight this last paragraph. Even more important is the issue of how intellectuals can contribute to the creation of emancipatory knowledge, one that contributes to world knowledge while also uplifting and improving the welfare of communities and peoples. And that, yan ko naka-highlight. It can just as easily become an exclusionary practice by which self-proclaimed and self-selecting insiders attempt to regulate the intellectual force field. So at the end, it becomes a question of who has really that power to demarcate stuff and barring them from contributing to debates and to emancipatory politics, as if the experience of being abroad were not part of what it now means to live as and call oneself Filipino. So it provides us a point of reflection for what it means to be a Filipino, what it means to be an intellectual at such a complicated crossroad. And hopefully we're able to contribute, I mean, through our own efforts to emancipatory knowledge, emancipatory politics, and stuff like that. Okay, so it's already 10 p.m. Thank you po sa inyong lahat sa pagdalo at especially those po who were assigned and who came and who really contributed po. So sana po next month magkita-kita po ulit tayo. As usual, ipo-post po natin yung ating registration form, pati po yung information. So ako, thank you po once again for being here po at sa pakikipaglahok sa discussion po.
Thank you po. Salamat po. Good evening.
Happy birthday.
Salamat.
Salamat bro. Salamat po
Thank you.
sa lahat.